Choked fields of 1918, a young soldier named Henri stared across no man's land. His hands trembled on a rifle he no longer believed in.
Difficult to up! Hold the line!
Europe in 1914 felt like the center of the universe. Cities glowed with electric lights. Factories roared day and night. Yet beneath the polished surface, something rotten was growing. Old empires clutched their power. Nationalism burned hot in every heart. It was a warm Sunday morning in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand rode through the streets beside his wife Sophie. They smiled at the crowds. They felt safe. And a young Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired. Both the Archduke and his wife were dead. In just 37 days, the dominoes had fallen.
Mobilization is confirmed. We depart at dawn.
The machinery of war was now fully in motion. Young men across Europe kissed their mothers goodbye and boarded trains, laughing, singing, convinced they would be home by Christmas. By September, the Western Front had locked into a deadly stalemate. Both sides dug in. Soldiers lived like rats in the earth. Rain turned the ground to thick, sucking mud. Lice crawled over their skin. Rats the size of cats feasted on the dead. Every night, the shells screamed in. Every morning, the dead were carried past the living. It was not the war their fathers had fought. Machine guns mowed down entire battalions before they crossed no man's land. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies froze and starved while their officers lived in luxury. German submarines hunted ships without warning. Britain blockaded Germany, slowly starving its people. By 1917, Germany launched one final desperate gamble on the Western Front. Then everything changed. Fresh American soldiers began pouring into France, 2 million strong. Germany's soldiers, hungry and outnumbered, began to surrender in waves. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. The battlefields looked like the surface of the moon. More than 9 million soldiers lay dead. Families received telegrams that broke them forever. The politicians gathered in Versailles and forced Germany to sign a treaty that blamed them for everything. A young Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler heard the news and wept with rage. In that rage, the seeds of the next war were already sprouting. The war that was supposed to end all wars had instead made the next one almost inevitable. And if we forget how it all began, we risk hearing the guns again. Entire towns had been erased. Forests were reduced to splinters. Rivers that once ran clear now carried the stain of blood for weeks. Mothers received telegrams they could not read without collapsing. Children grew up never knowing their fathers. The survivors carried wounds no one could see. They woke screaming at night, convinced the gas was coming again. More than 9 million soldiers lay dead. Another 7 million civilians starved, bombed, or taken by disease. The politicians gathered in Versailles to decide the future of the world. Germany was forced to sign a treaty that blamed them for everything. They lost land, colonies, their navy, and their pride. They were ordered to pay billions in reparations, money they did not have. Their army was reduced to a shadow. Humiliation was written into every line of the document. The once proud nation was brought to its knees. A young Austrian corporal recovering from a gas attack heard the news and wept with rage. He would later call the Treaty of Versailles the greatest crime in history. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had shattered into pieces. The Ottoman Empire was carved up like meat. The world map had been redrawn by men in suits who had never heard a shell explode. They were told this was the war to end all wars. They believed they had fought for something noble. They charged into machine gun fire because they loved their countries. They held dying friends and promised them the world would be better. It wasn't better. The peace they bought with their lives was fragile and poisoned. In the anger and shame that followed, dangerous new voices began to rise.
We will not be silenced! We will take back what is ours! Our time is now!
The seeds of resentment were planted deep in the broken soil of defeat. Economic ruin spread like wildfire. People lost everything they had left. Millions walked the streets without work, without hope, without a future. Families that had already lost sons now struggled to feed the ones who remained. Old hatreds that had simmered before the war now boiled over once again. The guns fell silent in 1918, but the echoes have never truly stopped. They whisper to us still across the decades, a warning of what happens when pride, fear, and old hatreds are allowed to grow unchecked. The warning lingered in the broken silence, but the world, exhausted and grieving, tried desperately to believe the nightmare was over. New nations rose from the ruins of old empires. Borders were redrawn. The League of Nations was born, promising to prevent another war. In Germany, money became worthless. Savings turned to dust overnight. People starved while prices rose by the hour.
What can we do?
In the chaos, a failed artist turned soldier saw his moment. Adolf Hitler and his followers attempted a bold coup in a Munich beer hall. The putsch failed. Hitler was arrested, but in prison he wrote his manifesto and learned a darker lesson. Power could be seized not by force alone, but by fear and persuasion. For a few years, things seemed to calm. Loans flowed in, life flickered back to normal. Yet the wounds of Versailles never truly healed. Then the Great Depression struck like a second plague. Factories shut down, millions lost their jobs. Despair returned deeper than before. Families that had survived one war now faced another kind of death. Slow, grinding poverty that stripped away dignity and hope. In the ruins of democracy, the Nazi Party promised revenge, jobs, and restored pride. Their message spread like fire through dry grass. Hitler's voice thundered across Germany. He blamed the old enemies, the treaty, and outsiders for every misery. Millions began to believe him. In 1933, Hitler was named Chancellor. Within months, he seized total control. Democracy died quietly in the halls of power.
The Reichstag burned. Blame fell on communists. Emergency powers followed. Opposition was crushed in the name of order.
Germany roamed in secret, then openly. The Treaty of Versailles was torn apart piece by piece while the world watched nervously.
Hitler sent troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. France and Britain protested but did nothing. The gamble had worked.
Next came Austria. The Anschluss united German-speaking peoples under the swastika. Again, the world stood by.
Leaders met in Munich and handed Hitler the Sudetenland, hoping to buy peace. Chamberlain returned home declaring peace for our time.
Many wanted to believe him,
But the sacrifice of Czechoslovakia only fed the wolf's appetite.
Months later, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. The promises of Munich lay broken on the ground.
Secretly, Germany and the Soviet Union made a pact. They agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. On September 1, 1939, without warning, German armies stormed into Poland. Blitzkrieg lightning war shattered the frontier.
Stukas screamed from the skies. Tanks crushed all resistance. Poland fought bravely but fell in weeks.
Britain and France declared war on Germany. The promises of 1918 had failed. Another world war had begun. The guns that fell silent in 1918 now roared again, louder and more terrible than before.
The story of one war had become the prelude to the next. Millions more would soon march into the darkness, because the world had forgotten the warning written in the mud of the trenches.